For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, PPIC is a nonpartisan think tank based in San Francisco with offices here in Sacramento. Here today is our board chair, Gary Hart, who's former Secretary of Education, former state senator. A number of other members of our staff are here joining us today. This event is part of the James Irvine Foundation briefing series, and we would like to thank them for making it possible to bring this program to you today. Before we get started with the program, I'd like to first bring to your attention the folder that you should have found on your chair, right? Very nice folder. What's inside of the folder that is, I think, particularly noteworthy? First of all, take a look at the bios of the participants today, not just me, but Craig and Deborah and HD and Juliet, who are here today as part of the panel, and Dave Lesher. We really thank them all for their participation. You'll find a piece on California state budget, which just came out, very short but very succinct and excellent summary of the recently proposed state budget that was authored by our policy associate here, Paul Warren. And Paul is on our staff and in our Sacramento office. So if you have any questions, please ask Paul. And we also have within this packet part of our briefing series on California's future, which is a short piece that is written by Paul and one of our fellows, Maggie Weston, both of them in our Sacramento office, called California Budget. So, as usual with PPIC, things to read and things to take home and ponder. Last but not least, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit today to get us started, there is a summary of the most recent survey in the Californians and Their Government series, which came out just yesterday, and this summary has highlights of attitudes at the state government level and the federal government level of the Californians we spoke to in our recent survey. And I would like to also acknowledge my colleague, Sonia Pettick, who was a project manager and a research associate in our San Francisco office, who's here today. And Sonia worked on this survey as well as other members of the survey team, but she was the project manager on it.
For those of you who are familiar with PPIC, you may have, this is a typical event for us in January to do a survey on the budget and to have a panel discussion about what we might expect coming up in the spring, including some of these same panelists have been with us before. Our hope is to take what we've heard from the governor's budget proposal, to consider the public attitudes that we've heard about in the survey, and then kind of project ahead and kind of do a curtain raiser or some kind of preview about the budget discussions that we expect to see develop during the spring here. So I just wanted to give a quick overview about the budget. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with it, but one thing we are all aware of in California today is that elections have consequences, and the world is very much different in California today than it would be if Proposition 30 had not passed. Instead of the trigger cuts that we might have expected then, and the restorations that would be required this year for a deficit probably in next year's budget, instead we're talking about recovery, things like stability, things like how do we build towards a more stable future. So that's a dramatic change. The governor proposed a budget that, as Mark talked about, the LAO described as kind of a baseline budget. It funds CalWORKs and IHSS. There's a slight increase for corrections and for UC system and CSU. There's an increase of $2.5 billion or so for K-12 schools, and there is a projection of surpluses beyond this year. So it's a very different picture than we've had in recent years. So one question I hope we get to the panel, how simple and easy might this budget process be? But on the other hand, there are a lot of policy decisions that are pretty significant in this budget that we're also going to that will have to be considered in the legislature. One of the poll questions referred to one about whether money should go to debt or whether it should go to restoring cuts. There's the question of how to distribute the K-12 money that's the governor put on the table. There's a special session about federal health care reform, and several other major issues on the table this year. So with that, I will introduce the panel, and we'll get to a discussion, and then I'll ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to some questions from the audience. You have a more detailed bio in your packet, but just a quick introduction. On the right side of the panel is Craig Cornett, who is the budget director for Senate President Darrell Steinberg. He's been there since, I think, 2008, and previous to that, many years working as budget director for several assembly speakers and in the LAO's office. And Deborah Gonzalez is the policy and fiscal director for Assembly Republican leader Connie Conway, who's been in the legislature about, I think, 20 years or more. H.D. Palmer is communications director, deputy director at the Department of Finance. Has worked in the Department of Finance for both Governor Schwarzenegger and Governor Brown, and many years before that with other government offices. And Juliette Williams has covered politics and government in Sacramento for the Associated Press since about 2005. So we have a very good panel that has a lot of perspective and experience to talk about the issues we're going to discuss today. I think I'm going to open it up with just kind of this curtain raiser or preview kind of question. And Craig will probably start with you. But given the poll results, given the budget proposal of the governor, when you look forward, is this going to be a simple, quick, easy, quiet budget season, or are there things that you are watching for that are flashpoints and potential areas of debate or change or things like that? So.
Yes. Well, thanks for having me, Dave and Mark. I think there is a certain appetite for controversy on the budget, no matter what. There's a certain threshold. You're always going to have a certain amount. The issue is the threshold of where it is. In the past, the threshold has been very high, where you have a lot of controversy and a lot of very controversial things. This year, the threshold is going to be much different. Because if you think about it, I just was looking at some numbers. If you think about the numbers, 59, 10, 27, and 16, what do those numbers represent? Well, those numbers represent the last 4 years, the level of budget solutions that have had to be adopted each year by the legislature. In 2009, it was $59 billion worth of budget solutions. In 2010, it was $10 billion, $27 billion in 2011, and $16 billion last year. Now, this year, we're in a very different situation, where we're actually able to look much more forward, I think. But as you said, the governor has put a lot of very interesting and some controversial policy issues on the table for discussion, all of which are very good discussion points. So I think this year we'll be able to have a different kind of a budget dialogue. Now, I also don't want to miss the fact, though, that there is still a lot of uncertainty out there. More so than maybe in the past. My assembly counterpart remarked the other day, and I think I can quote him okay on this, by saying that the budget, unfortunately, has become a lot like an NBA game, where most of the action's in the last 2 minutes. And we're going to see that this year because we don't really have a sense of where our revenue picture is going to fall in May at all. We saw a big spike in revenues this last month, but we could wind up giving all of that back on April 15th. So we have a lot of questions there. We don't know enough about what the federal government is going to do to us, frankly, and what effect they may have yet. So I think we're in a very cautious, wary stage right now, I think, as to where things will all land. I will say, though, it's a whole different atmosphere and a whole different conversation. I think that we're happy and glad to be in this position, though.
Deborah?
Well, as you know, Republicans don't usually follow polls in California. No, just kidding. Oh, yes, I'm just a little bitter, but it's okay. I actually think this is, in a way, a little more difficult for the legislative leaders, and particularly the Democrats, because what looks like a lot more resources means that there's a lot more people who want to have programs restored, and that there's obviously a lot of unmet need in the last few years. But I think the revenue volatility continues to be a concern. The way Prop 30 enhanced that volatility concerns us. The fact that we are still sitting on $28 billion of budgetary debt, and then we have, up to, depending on what study you look at, $60 billion of other unmet needs. But I think we need to be cautious, and I think that's why Connie is quoted as saying that the governor channeled his inner Republican when he talked about fiscal austerity. Somebody ought to channel a Republican. No, just kidding. It's just one of those situations. But we believe, we look at the budget a little differently. This budget actually, when you add back realignment, is the biggest budget that we've seen in history in California. And we count realignment because those programs were general fund programs, and those were general fund dollars that just went to the locals, but they're still programs that are being funded by taxpayers and spent by taxpayers for taxpayer programs. And so we're at $104 billion when you look at that. If you take this new revenue that showed up in January, the $4.9 billion, and you spend that, which we would caution against, we think we're creating a new California fiscal cliff that we don't think would be prudent. And so, for instance, one of the concerns that we have is that the governor waives the Prop 58 reserve requirement as part of this proposed budget. That was before the $4.9 billion showed up, but he proposed that. We would suggest that that probably isn't a prudent thing to do. If you recall, Prop 58 was created, it was passed, I think, by the voters in 2000, I want to say... Four? Okay, oh, thanks. Mm-hmm. I have no long-term memory. That's why I stay in the legislature. But it was created, and it requires the state to put away 3% of revenues up to $8 billion or 5% of total general fund spending. And the idea was to avoid these kind of big ups and downs and be able to smooth out the budget when we have these downturns. And I just went back and I looked at one of the reasons this would have been helpful is in 2006 we had a $95 billion budget, and it spiked up to $102.5 billion. So we had a $7.1 billion spike. We, of course, my caucus, as much as the Democrat caucus, we spent that money. And we only had a reserve of about $900 million. That next year, our general fund revenues were down to the $82 billion. I mean, it was a dramatic drop. We cut education by $8 billion. If we had put away some of that $7.1 billion, we would have been able to soften the blow. We wouldn't have been able to eliminate it. I mean, the crisis, and we spent a lot of time in Big Five and with many long nights and weekends and holidays. I think all of us did during that crisis in 2008 and 2009. We wouldn't have been able to eliminate that, but we could have softened the blow and particularly avoided some of the deep education cuts. So we would be on the side of the 55% of Californians, again, that's first-time Republicans, a majority, that want to spend down not to spend, but to actually put more money into a reserve and to spend down debt.
Mm-hmm.
Spend down on debt.
So, HD, I want you to look ahead, but also could you explain this $5 billion bump we saw this week?
Explain it.
Yeah. Before everybody's eyes start bugging out, we think that obviously the personal income tax receipts are outpacing our projections. But before everybody assumes that is A, because of the economy, and B, that we can spend it, we, as well as the legislative analysts, have a couple cautionary notes. We think two things are in play here. Number one, a lot of folks, not knowing what the federal rules of the road were going to be on the tax structure, accelerated a lot of their income into 2012. And a lot of the final payments on that were due on January the 15th. The second thing involves Prop 30. As most of you know, the Prop 30 higher top marginal brackets covered the 2012 tax year, not just starting with the 2013 tax year. And so a lot of people, anecdotally we're finding out, are being told, pay your obligation now instead of in April, even though there's no penalty. So we think those two things may be artificially bumping up the money that we're seeing in January. And as everybody is cautioning, what we get in January that may be related to Prop 30, we may get less in April. So we can't take it for granted or assume that this is a revenue surge that's going to be ongoing. All the more reason, in our view, that we need to be prudent in terms of holding the line on program expansion or buying back a lot of the difficult but necessary reductions that we've made in recent years.
Mm-hmm. So you're going forward pretty smooth, or anything in particular
Well, we'll see. I think
to develop this year?
Craig touched on a couple of these things that while we think we are in a gradual recovery and we think there's a gradual revenue growth that's going to go with that, there's still some uncertainties out there, what Donald Rumsfeld would call known unknowns. One is just happened yesterday. The Senate passed a debt limit ceiling increase, but it's temporary, and it expires in May, right around the time when we're going to be putting together the May revision. And if we have a protracted debate over the debt ceiling and we have the potential for an economic downturn, that's going to affect us. Sequestration, the automatic across-the-board reductions in spending are scheduled to go into effect on March the 1st. Half of it, $54.6 billion in defense, half in non-defense, same amount. So that could have a dampening effect on the economy. So again, these unknowns, as it were, give us, it's all the more reason to be prudent in terms of not, retrenching or being an expansion of state government again and return us back to the situation that the governor talked about in the State of the State address, where you've got the kind of boom and bust, increase and then cut cycle that he thinks is unfair.
Thanks. I'm so glad to hear this is not going to be a boring budget year. It sounds like there is a lot of...
Sorry to let you down.
Super boring.
So, Juliet, what are you hearing about what this budget year might look like?
Well, I think it's going to be fascinating to watch how the governor navigates all of this because, as Deborah said, there is a lot of pent-up demand, not just for these services, but from Democrats in the legislature who are beholden to their various constituencies. And so he's going to have to walk this tightrope of being the fiscally conservative Democrat leading these two-thirds houses as he tries to push some pretty substantive policy issues that we haven't seen the last governor have any success with, from education, water, CEQA reform. I mean, these are big, big things. So that's what I'm watching for.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, thank you. So one thing I wanted to ask about the supermajority this year, because obviously in the past, for many years, that's been a major budget issue. There have been many years where, the requirement for a supermajority vote was what determined what the budget looked like. Now we have a supermajority in the Democratic side, and I guess my question is, and I'll start with you, Deborah, especially for the Republican caucus or Republican side, how does the Republican side respond in the supermajority environment? And also, I'm interested whether anybody thinks that the supermajority vote will come into play in some way in the budget process here.
I don't really think it would have had much of effect this year, or will have much of effect this year, because of the nature of we really have the revenues we need. And so really, since we passed Prop 25, which changed the vote requirement to a majority vote to pass the budget, and it was only 2/3 vote to get taxes, I don't believe we're going to see a big tax vote. I could be wrong, but I don't think we'll see a big tax vote. I think the really interesting dynamic, and particularly in the Assembly, is the fact that 38 members are new, and 28 of them are Assembly Democrats. And that's a dynamic that we haven't experienced before. With the special elections, we will have 40 new members in the Assembly who haven't served in the Assembly before. For a while there, we were getting some, I wouldn't call them retreads, but they were members who had been there before and had come back and they were serving. But at this point, we really don't have, these are true freshman members who have no experience on the budget, have a lot of local government experience. If anybody watched the hearing in the Assembly, which I thought was very good yesterday, they have very strong ideas about policy and ideas, but they're not necessarily, they haven't been through the budget wars. So they may not have that residual feeling that we need to restore stuff that they never participated in cutting. But on the other hand, they may have a more of affinity for the local governments that our members, once they've been up here, have lost over time, particularly faced with crisis. So I think the newness of the members is going to be more dramatic than the 2/3 vote issue, because there's just not that much you need a 2/3 vote for anymore.
Mm-hmm. How about HD?
I would agree with Deborah. I think one of the things that it's going to be interesting to watch, as we talked about, is this is a pretty policy-heavy budget. There's always going to be whether or not certain procedures or certain proposals should be in a policy committee or in the fiscal realm. And probably the biggest one is going to be the issue of the governor's local control funding formula for schools. For those of you who are following this, by the way, by the close of business today, we intend to have the trailer bill language posted on our website at the Department of Finance under the budgeting tab. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the governor is, again, a refined proposal from what he's put forward before that has to do with restructuring the state's school funding formula. Particularly to focus it on the issue of those students who have, the research shows us, the greatest challenges in learning. Of the roughly 6.2 million students in K through 12 schools in California, more than half, 3.3 million, are either English learners or they're from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, as measured by their eligibility for free and reduced price lunches. So what the governor is proposing to do in this funding formula is that in addition to the growth that all districts will see, he is proposing to target an additional increment of growth to districts based upon the proportion of those students who are either English learners or economically disadvantaged, because these are the students who have the greatest challenges to learn, and these are the students who the administration wants to give the greatest opportunity to achieve. Now, one of the things that we will be doing is we will be doing district by district projections or runs of how this is going to play out. Those aren't done yet. But we would emphasize that, unlike some of the critics, this is not a proposal to rob Peter to pay Paul. That's going to be a debate about urban versus rural districts or urban versus suburban districts. Everybody is going to see growth, but we're proposing to target an increment of that growth to this band of students. The other thing that the governor's funding proposal is going to do is to further break down the so-called categorical programs and give more flexibility and more authority to local school districts to allocate those dollars, because we think that has to go hand in hand with this new funding formula. So probably the earliest policy debate you're going to be seeing a lot of focus on, I think, is going to be on the school funding formula.
So supermajority, are we going to see that come into play at all?
I agree with Deborah. I just think that it wasn't a factor last year when circumstances were a little bit different. I don't think it's going to be a factor again this year.
Great. And Julia, what's your impression of what the supermajority means to this budget discussion? And also, I wonder what you do cover politics. The new members that Deborah talked about. Not only are they new, but they have this perspective of potentially serving 12 years in the Assembly instead of 6 in the Assembly.
Right.
And also they were elected under a top 2 system, so some of them came to the legislature in a different route than would have been possible before. So
Right.
how has the supermajority and this new membership changed the political equation and discussion that we might see in the budget?
I think the hope is that because they are here for longer, that we can have some of these more substantive policy debates without the need for constantly running again, or the fear of repercussions along with the top 2, and that we'll have a more moderate legislature. I think a lot of people are expecting that you hear about 2/3, and that it's Democrats controlling, and they're going to push an ultra-liberal agenda. But many of the Democrats, I'd say, I don't know, a quarter maybe, are much more moderate and more conservative. So I think that'll.
Mm-hmm. So different than before.
I think so, and I think that's the hope, that we have some more substantive policy discussions on the education reform, which is going to be a big one this year.
Craig, do you see the supermajority having an effect or coming into play here?
Not in the shorter term, and I think there was a lot of hyperbole during the campaign in the fall about you get a supermajority here in the Senate in particular, because everybody expected the Senate to go to a supermajority. I think not so much in the Assembly. That was a bit of a surprise.
It was surprising to us, too.
Sorry about that.
But our caucuses are smaller. We don't have to get extra tables. It's okay.
That's right. But I think there was a lot of silliness in the air about, the Democrats are just going to want to raise taxes and so forth with a supermajority. Democrats don't want to raise it. Nobody likes raising taxes. Let me be real clear about that. I think it's not a fun vote for anybody to cast. I work for a very progressive member of the legislature, and I think even the most progressive members have realized the last number of years they're the ones who have put up the really tough votes to make the cuts we've had to do. So I think that's they're in a different place, I would say. Now, over the longer haul, I would say, though, the one thing about the supermajority is it does provide a little better opportunity for dialogue about more fundamental kind of questions and reforms. For example, in Mark's slide presentation, he mentioned the public support for the moving to 55% for parcel taxes for schools. That's a very legitimate discussion to have. That would require a 2/3 vote to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot to do that. That's the kind of thing I think you will see, those kind of broader policy conversations going on. But nothing can go to the ballot until the 2014 election anyway. So you've got some time. I think you will start seeing some broader kind of conversation about those kinds of things. But so it's not so much in the immediate.
So next year. You'll want to come to the panel next year.
Yeah.
Mark your calendars 12 months from now.
I think that's true.
We're going to have a Mythbuster panel here because, I mean, there was a sense of this budget having stability, and you're telling us there's no stability. There was, a sense that the supermajority would make a difference, and we're seeing, okay, I don't see it coming into play here.
I think everything's all relative. I mean, on the budget stability, it's a lot more stable than it has been, but nothing's perfect. No budget ever is, frankly, though.
So, Juliet, I'll start with you on this one, but I wanted to ask about this trade-off that we saw in the poll question about, what do you do when you get to a budget like this? Do you use it to pay down the debt that we've accumulated, or do you use it to restore some of the cuts that we spent? And, it was very interesting. It's 55% of people say, to go with the paying down the debt, and how it breaks down is very interesting too. It was almost evenly divided among Democrats, and then very strong support for the debt payment among Republicans and Independents. But I guess I just wonder what you're hearing in terms of how much pushback might we see to what the governor put on the table in terms of the debt approach. Are you hearing that there might be people who want to go the other way and restore some of these
There
cuts?
are always people who want to spend whatever money we have coming in. I think that makes sense, what we see in the poll with people wanting to pay it down, because Californians have just lived through this recession themselves, and they've endured the cuts. They've seen the cuts at their schools. And so even though they're probably eager to have those things be restored, there's also a sense of like we weren't maybe prepared as prepared as we should have been for the recession in terms of a rainy day fund and building up all this debt. I think that pool of money is some of the limited money that might be there to play with in terms of Democratic priorities. So I think there are definitely going to be members pushing for their various agendas. I expect that the governor will remain pretty firm on it because he seems the wall of debt has been something that he's talked about a lot, and that has seemed to be a priority for him, and that was an emphasis in his budget release also. Mm-hmm. So I think that'll be where maybe we see some of it playing out between the governor holding the line and some of the Democratic constituency trying to use that money.
Uh-huh. Good. And I wanted to say a special thank you for participating today because of your broken wing here. Julia broke her arm in a skiing accident recently, so she's learning how to type very slowly.
Actually, journalism is a contact sport.
So, HD, how much of an issue do you think this directional debate is going to be about how to use this money?
I think Juliet and Deborah are right. There's going to be push and pull on this because you can't legislate against pent-up demand. It's going to be there, and there are going to be certain individuals and certain groups who are going to want to say, okay, the worst is behind us. Let's kind of undo the cuts that we did before. But the governor has basically said, in terms of outside of the education area and some of the healthcare area, this is the new base. This is the new normal. And we're kind of heartened by seeing the results of the poll regarding the public's view on paying down this past debt. And under our long range plan, we cut it down to 1/7 of what it'll be this year, from about $27.8 billion to $5.8 billion at the end of the 16-17 fiscal year. And that's not just a view that is shared, within this town and within this building. As most of you know, Standard & Poor's, one of the 3 credit rating agencies, actually gave us an upgrade, something we haven't seen in a long time. And one of the things that they talked about in their write-up on why they were upgrading us dealt with this issue. And if you'll bear with me for a second, I'll just briefly read the passage. If the state can fully eliminate the wall of debt as the governor projects, the legacy of Proposition 30 would endure for much longer than the taxes themselves. And while reversing all of the budget liabilities comes at the expense of building up a budget reserve, we view it as no less beneficial from a credit standpoint. So we actually believe that building a reserve and paying down debt isn't an either-or proposition. We think we can do both. Under our long-range projections in 3 years, we project our budget reserve will be at about $2.5 billion. So we can go back and forth on the size of the budget. But the governor believes the most critical thing right now is paying down that wall of debt. We need to get to a point where we are not using today's dollars to pay off yesterday's bills. And so you can expect the governor to continue to hammer home this point about the critical nature of paying down the wall of debt.
Deborah, do you have a perspective?
It's a big priority for our caucus. I think that there's little flexibility in terms of monkeying with the remaining debt repayment, because about $1.4 billion is ERB repayments, which are contractually required to be paid. So we can't, as a legislature, step back from those payments. Mm-hmm. But I think $2.5 billion of it is education. 1.9. See, I just kind of throw numbers out there, but but that's why we have a problem. But the education debt repayment doesn't benefit other expenditure repayments. It's part of Prop 98, and so it will be going to education, whether it's debt repayment or some other education repayment. So there's only about $1 billion of what we would call discretionary debt repayment that the legislature could pull back from its obligation on, because the governor already stepped back a little bit from his original schedule from last year. He reduced the debt repayment schedule by about $1 billion over what he was proposing last year. So there really is very little they could do there. And so I think that we'll see a lot of debt repayment on the books.
Mm-hmm. Greg, how big of how much of a constituency is there for the alternative to the debt?
Well, I think the interesting thing is my boss started in November after the LAO in their November report, the Legislative Analyst Office, showed that we were going to see growing surpluses. Now that was all based on current law, just assuming no change to current law or no change in policy. The LAO showed we would start seeing growing surpluses over the years, up to about $9 billion over time. Now, the governor's proposal came out in January, and he basically showed we would be in balance every year, as the LAO showed, essentially, but showed that there really wasn't that kind of a $9 billion spike at the end of the period. The reason for that, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the governor's numbers on Prop 98 were higher, so more money was going to go to the schools on the natural. And the second thing that the governor was doing, too, is he was also putting money into some debt payment and also into certain policy areas, like higher education especially. Higher education in UC and CSU, he's got a major proposal on the table to make some changes there in how we fund higher education, and with a sort of a guarantee to UC and CSU of roughly a 5% increase each year as they go along. That doesn't sound like a lot, but the compounding effect of that takes a lot of money off the table. But I would tell you what my boss said in November after the LAO report came out. He said, look, as we think about these growing surpluses, let's think about using money in a third. A third of it to buy down the debt, a third of it to put in the reserve, and a third of it to restore some of the worst cuts we've done. The governor's framework isn't all that different from what Senator Steinberg was suggesting in so many ways, because the governor's restoring a lot of money back to higher ed and to the schools as well, and buying down a lot of debt. There's not a lot of left over for the reserve, for the budget stabilization account, however. I would just reiterate what Deborah said. If you look in the first year of this period, the governor's assuming in the budget year he would buy down the debt by about $4.2 billion. Most of that is money that you couldn't undo anyway, because almost $2 billion of it is Prop 98. That's buying down the debt we have on deferred payments to the schools. And $1.5 billion of that is the economic recovery bonds. So if you look at what's left that's being paid off this first year, it's only about $600 or $700 million. So there's not a huge amount of headroom in that period. Over the longer haul, there's more headroom, but I think everyone does believe, again, starting with my boss, believes that buying down the debt's a good thing for our long-term fiscal health. Frankly, it also has some effect, too, of freeing up our ability to spend money on other things as we go along as well.
Thank you. Just a lightning round question, and then I want to get to the audience. But just kind of a bottom line. I mean, we've talked about the uncertainty in the revenue this year. We've talked about what HD talked about. Perhaps the major controversy might be how we spend the education money this year, and we talked about the trade-off of restoring cuts versus debt. The bottom line question is, should we expect that the eventual budget is going to substantially look like what the governor put on the table, or is it too soon to tell? Why don't we start, Craig, and come back this way?
I think it's a little too soon to tell in certain things. I mean, some of the parameters, I certainly believe some of the parameters will stay the same. But I do think it's a little early to tell, especially on some of the bigger policy issues. In the K-12 education, the local control funding formula HD mentioned, that's a very, very good idea, the notion of trying to put more money where it's really needed. But the devil's really in the details there, and that's going to take a lot of unwinding and a lot of conversation and a lot of looking to see how that would look, especially over time. So that's a major policy conversation. The other big areas that the governor has put extra money in higher ed, as I mentioned, again, some very good, and by the way, on the local control funding formula, one thing that we think is going to really need to be done there is whatever the legislature entertains there, I think it's going to have to come with a lot of additional accountability. In the area of higher education, there's a lot of things the governor's put on the table that the folks I work for will really like. The notion of trying to ensure that there are no more tuition increases at UC and CSU, and that we can get more accountability and quicker time to graduation for students. Those are all things my folks would really like. Again, the devil's going to be in the details, though, and the accountability issues to the systems are very important. And the third major area the governor has is in the area of healthcare expansion, which I think my folks very much support, too. But that's going to be a very difficult to unwind as to how to actually do that, meet the requirements of the ACA. So I think something in all three of those areas could easily be there in the end, but I think that's what the legislative process is about. We're having our first hearings on these issues on 14th of February, a hearing on the higher ed proposals, on the 21st on the health proposals, and on the 28th on the K through 12 proposals. So we need a strong public vetting of all of these things and a lot of conversation and a lot of looking at.
Deborah, high expectations for change in what's on the table?
I think the numbers will be the easiest part of the budget proposal, and it is the policy changes that will be difficult. I mean, I'm much more skeptical that we'll get to the education proposal because of the delay, the fact that education has taken such a dramatic decline in so long, and even though we're restoring money, if we restore it unevenly, the districts that are getting less, even though they're getting more, I don't know if that's, they're getting less, but they're getting more. They will be concerned because their baseline funding hasn't been restored. And so at what point are schools at a baseline funding level, and then you can impose this new regime? I think we continue to have concerns about the Medi-Cal expansion because the LAO has told us that it will increase healthcare costs by $3 to $10 billion over the next 10 years. That's a significant growth, and it would be the fastest growing program, faster than education. And of course, there's a lot of implementation issues related to would it be a county-based system or a state-based system, and that I think something happens there just because of the federal mandate of the 2014, but I think that's going to be very difficult, and our caucus will be concerned about the expenditure levels. I think we agree in higher ed, accountability and moving kids quickly through the system. I actually have a college-age child and a soon-to-be college-age child, and the idea of your kid taking 6 years to get out of a UC school or 8 years to get a CSU system is frightening, and it's not very productive for the state's economy. So I think it's speeding up the process and making sure kids are able to get the classes they want, making sure that fees are at an appropriate level has been a priority of our caucus as well. So I think that's probably where the easiest policy debate will be. The other two, I think, are much more difficult.
And by the way, I agree totally with Deborah on the local education.
See, I
on the
love when they
local
do that. They
funding
agree
formula.
totally.
Yeah, the local funding formula. That's going to be a very difficult thing
Very
in part
difficult.
because we schools are so far down. How do you kind of build back and do this? Although, again, in concept, it's a great
Yeah.
concept. So
Local control. Love
Yeah.
that.
Great. HD, expectations for any difference between now and the end?
What's it going to look like at the end? Ask me in May. Because all the uncertainties that we've talked about, we don't know. But stop and think about this for a minute. What have we been doing the last few Januaries when we've had this? We've been in a triage mode. It's been like the opening scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark. We're trying to run against that thing. It's about to run us over. What are we talking about today? We're talking about through the budget process, we want to have a thoughtful, thorough policy discussion on a number of very critical issues. That is a sea change from where we have been. And I think the moment shouldn't go unnoticed that we finally gotten to a place where we all want to be. And that's interestingly enough for our Department of Finance, for the administration, I think for the legislature as well. That takes a mind shift because we have been so used to, trying to outrun that boulder that's going to run us over that, okay, we think that we're past the boulder, it's not going to run us over. Let's catch our breath and figure out thoughtfully where do we go from here. And I think, that's a welcome change from where we've been in recent years.
Good. And Juliet, just quickly, are you hearing a lot of appetite for change in this budget, or should we?
No, I mean, I think it is all revolving around these policy debates, and I guess maybe we'll have more details on the governor's soon to come on the education, the K-12 reform. As I think it was Deborah who said that it was maybe Craig, that this has been something a long time coming to reform the school funding system, but each of those categorical programs was established because there was a constituency for that spending. And so there's going to be a fight over every aspect of that and over every aspect of the money. I think a lot of people are expecting that schools will be robust and fully funded again because they voted for Prop 30, and they think, that the state is flush with money, and they may be disappointed when they find out otherwise. So.
Great. So, well, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our time. I want to give
End on an A.
It was a great discussion. It was kind of like a pregame show for the Super Bowl and the budget we're about to see. So I thought it was very, very enlightening. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.